Apple, Samsung, Tesla. Every month, another headline about Western companies moving to India. The narrative is everywhere. India is the new China, the next global factory. But here's what they don't tell you. India has 6,000 kilometers of expressways. China has 191,000. India has zero high-speed rail. China has 45,000 kilometers. This isn't a gap, it's a chasm. Today, we are looking at the real numbers behind India's manufacturing ambitions. Not the hype, not the hope, the infrastructure data, the skills reality, the timeline truth. And what you will see might surprise you. So let's start with why the India narrative makes sense on paper. Because honestly, it does seem logical at first glance. First of all, China's costs are rising. Manufacturing wages jumped from $2,000 a year in 2005 to over $12,000 today. At the same time, geopolitics is pushing diversification. Trade wars, tech restrictions, supply chain risk exposed by COVID-19. Meanwhile, India seems perfectly positioned. Same population size as China, 1.4 billion people. Young workforce, median age 28. Democratic government, English speakers, and on top of that, Modi's Make in India campaign is offering tax breaks and fast-track approvals. And the announcements keep coming. Apple targeting 25% iPhone production in India. Foxconn committing billions. Samsung building massive plants. Furthermore, Goldman Sachs said India will be the world's third largest economy by 2030. It's a compelling story. Rising democratic India, declining authoritarian China. The greatest manufacturing shift of all time. But here is the thing. There is what sells and what's real. And the reality is in the infrastructure numbers. So let's dig into them. Here is what most people don't understand. Manufacturing needs infrastructure, not just factories. The entire ecosystem. Roads, ports, power, and rail. China spent 3 decades building this. India, on the other hand, is just starting. Let me start with expressways. December 2024 data shows India has 6,059 kilometers operational expressways. Another 11,000 kilometers under construction. That's actually real progress from just 2,000 kilometers in 2020. However, China has 191,000 kilometers operational at the moment. That's 31 times larger. Now this matters because modern manufacturing is about speed. A Shenzhen factory ships components to Shanghai 1,200 kilometers away in 12 hours on 8-lane expressways. In contrast, the same distance in India, Bangalore to Delhi takes 36 hours to mix traffic and congestion. Moving on to high-speed rail, the story gets even more stark. China operates 45,000 kilometers. Trains at 350 kilometers per hour connects every major manufacturing hub. Meanwhile, India's first bullet train, Mumbai to Ahmedabad, is 48% complete. Expected to open partially in 2027, fully by 2030. And current operational high-speed rail in India, zero. Next, let's talk about ports, which are critical because manufacturing now is global. Shanghai handled 47 million container units in 2024. In comparison, India's largest port, JNPT Mumbai, handled 7.3 million. That's 1/6 the capacity. Now to be fair, India has improved. Container turnaround dropped from 93 hours in 2014 to 49 hours in 2025. That's real progress, worth acknowledging. But here is the catch. Shanghai processes containers in 24 hours. Those extra 25 hours multiplied across thousands of shipments add 12 to 15% to costs. That's the difference between competitive and uncompetitive. Finally, power reliability seals it. China generates 9 trillion kilowatt hours annually at 99.99% reliability. Chinese factories never lose power. Conversely, India generates 1.9 trillion kilowatt hours with 95% reliability in industrial zones. 5% unreliability means backup generators, added costs, and for precision manufacturing like semiconductors, ruined production batches. Here is what explains why this won't change quickly. China invests $500 billion yearly in infrastructure, while India invests $120 billion. Therefore, at current rates, catching up takes decades. And meanwhile, China isn't waiting. Now, infrastructure is hardware, skills are software. And here the numbers are complicated. On the surface, headlines say India graduates 2.5 million STEM students yearly. China graduates 3.6 million. Sounds close, right? But that misses everything that matters. Here is the reality. India's IITs are world class. They produce maybe 15,000 graduates annually who can compete anywhere. However, India has over 6,000 engineering colleges with wildly different quality. In fact, a 2019 student found 80% of Indian engineering graduates needed significant retraining before being job ready. In contrast, China built something different. Working with Germany, they created vocational systems where students learn in classrooms and factories simultaneously. 11,000 vocational schools producing 10 million skilled workers annually. Not just engineers, CNC operators, electronic assemblers, and quality control specialists. The people who actually make manufacturing work. So what about India's vocational training? It's fragmented and underfunded. Only 5% of India's workforce has formal technical training. Meanwhile, China is approaching 50%. South Korea is already at 96% and Germany is at 75%. These all shows up in defect rates. Chinese factories run 2 to 3% defects. Indian factories average 8 to 12%. For automotive or aerospace, where tolerances are tight, that's often disqualifying. Beyond that, there's also institutional knowledge you can't import. China has been the world's factory for 30 years. 3 generations grew up around manufacturing that accumulated problem-solving wisdom, process optimization knowledge, supply chain understanding that doesn't exist in India at scale. You can't buy it, it must be built over time. But here's what matters. India isn't failing at everything. In fact, India is succeeding impressively in specific sectors, just not traditional manufacturing. For instance, India dominates IT services. Infosys, Wipro, TCS, they are global giants. Indian software engineers are world-class. Bangalore rivals Silicon Valley for certain tech talent. This is real and valuable success. Similarly, pharmaceuticals show India can do high-value manufacturing. India supplies 20% of global generic drugs and 60% of vaccines. During COVID-19, India's vaccine capacity was crucial globally. This proves India can master complex and regulated industries. Additionally, automotive for domestic markets is growing. Maruti, Hyundai, Tata produce millions of vehicles annually. But here is the key differences. These are for Indian consumers. India exported 680,000 vehicles in 2023, while China exported 4.9 million. So what's the pattern here? India succeeds in knowledge-intensive industries that aren't infrastructure dependent. You can write software with unreliable power using battery backups. You can make pharmaceuticals in single controlled facilities. However, you cannot run massive electronics assembly needing 200 suppliers without world-class logistics. You cannot manufacture smartphones, cars, industrial equipment at Chinese scale without Chinese level infrastructure. Therefore, India's wins are real but specialized. They prove India can compete in specific niches. They don't prove India can replace China's comprehensive manufacturing ecosystem. So if not India, then who? The answer surprises people. Multiple countries taking small pieces, none replacing China entirely. First, Vietnam is the biggest winner. Samsung moved most smartphone production there. Nike and Adidas make shoes there. Vietnam's export grew 500% in 15 years. But here is the limitation. Vietnam had just 98 million people. It physically cannot absorb China's capacity serving 1.4 billion. Vietnam captures maybe 5 to 10% of production leaving China. Great for Vietnam, but not a threat to China. Second, Mexico benefits from nearshoring. American companies want shorter supply chains. Automotive, aerospace, and electronics are growing. USMCA gives market access. Nevertheless, Mexico has security issues, infrastructure gaps outside industrial zones, and skilled labor shortages. Mexico can take some production, not replace China. Third, Bangladesh dominates garment manufacturing, which left China years ago as wages rose. 40 billion in clothing exports annually, but garments are the lowest value manufacturing, most easily moved. This doesn't translate to electronics, machinery, or automotive. Meanwhile, Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia is grow in specific areas. It has limits, population, infrastructure, skills, and political stability. The bottom line, no single country has China's combination. Massive scale, developed infrastructure, skilled workforce, mature ecosystem. And here is the reality. Manufacturing is diversifying, not consolidating. Products once made entirely in China now come from 5 countries. iPhones assembled in India use components from China, Vietnam, Taiwan, and South Korea. India adds maybe 10 to 15% value, but China still captures 60%. Consequently, this diversification is making supply chains more complex and expensive. Companies accept higher costs for geopolitical risk reduction, but they are learning no alternatives matching China's efficiency. Total cost of living China, including logistics, quality control, and coordination complexity often exceed wage savings. So why does everyone keep saying India will replace China? There are several reasons. First, geopolitics. Western governments want China alternatives for strategic reasons. India is democratic, a strategic partner, and a counterbalance. Officials promote India because they want it to succeed, not because data supports the replacement story. Second, financial incentives. Investment banks sell India-focused investments. If Goldman or Morgan Stanley convinces investors India is the next China, they generate massive fees from funds, IPOs, and deals. The incentive is optimism, not realism. Third, media loves simple stories. India rising, China declining fits geopolitical narratives. Democracy versus authoritarianism. It is easier to write that headline than explain the complex reality that manufacturing is diversifying across multiple nations while China maintains dominance and moves upmarket. Fourth, real growth gets conflated with replacement. India's economy grows 6 to 7% annually. Manufacturing is expanding, new factories are being built, foreign investment is increasing. But here's the crucial distinction. India growing and India replacing China are completely different claims. India can double manufacturing and still be a fraction of China's scale. The truth is nuanced. India will grow significantly, manufacturing will expand, some production will shift from China, especially for Indian domestic markets. India will become more important for specific products and sectors. But replacing China, the infrastructure gap is measured in decades, while the skills gap is generational. The timeline is 20 to 30 years minimum. Here is why. China's dominance was built over 30 years with over 15 trillion in infrastructure investment, focused education producing hundreds of millions of skilled workers, and systematic industrial strategy coordinating everything from ports to vocational training. India is making progress, building faster than before. But even with perfect execution from today forward, China will still dominate manufacturing in 2030, likely 2035, and most probably 2040 as well. So let me wrap this up. The question was never whether India matters. India absolutely does. The question is whether India replaces China in manufacturing. Based on infrastructure data, skills assessment, and realistic projects, the answer is clear. It's a definite no. Here's what India's future actually looks like. Bright prospects in services, IT, pharmaceuticals, and domestic manufacturing. These are high-value sectors with real growth potential, but they are not the broad export manufacturing that made China the world's factory. Instead, manufacturing is diversifying globally. Vietnam, Mexico, Bangladesh, Thailand, and India all capture pieces. But no single country replicates what China built. The infrastructure is too extensive, the skills too specialized, the ecosystem too interdependent. Companies will keep announcing India's investments. Some will succeed, some will struggle. But when you look at where global manufacturing actually happens in 2030, China will still dominate. The gap might narrow slightly, but replacement, that's just narrative, not a reality. Here are three takeaways that matters. 1. Infrastructure gaps takes decades to close, not years. 2. No single country replaces China. Diversification is the real story. 3. India's strength lies elsewhere, in knowledge industries and domestic markets. Ultimately, the world isn't waiting for one country to replace another. It's adapting to a more complex, diversified manufacturing landscape where China remains central but not exclusive. If this analysis added value, subscribe for data-driven geopolitics every week. What's your take today? Can any country replace China, or is diversification the realistic future? Comment below. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you in the next video. Until then, stay curious and stay with FactoPiaX.